Here's a crazy story about a time I was given IV ketamine. I was in the hospital for another reason. I think it was because I had C. diff or some type of gut issues. I was dialyzing, and I remember I saw my nephrologist. At that time, I noticed that there was a little bit of blood coming out of my private area. Because this kind of freaked me out a little bit, I said something. Horrible decision. Doctor says, no problem. Mind you, I was supposed to be going home the next day after being in the hospital for more than a week. He schedules a cystoscopy for the next day. That procedure is when they go inside your pee-pee, they do a biopsy, and they look around to see what's going on. Because I'm a dialysis patient for more than 20 years, I don't urinate like that. I go to sleep that night not thinking nothing of it. Next morning, very early, get my anesthesia, put me to sleep, and the procedure starts. Now, the next thing that happened when I became conscious was that I woke up in the ICU recovery room, as you do. Amount of pain that instantly hit me when I was aware and conscious was so unbearable, to the point where I was just screaming like, oh my God, what did y'all do? It was so painful. It was like somebody stabbed me with more than 1,000 knives, and I was shooting an inferno of fire, just like that. They were hitting me with so much Dilaudid in a 2-hour period that the ICU nurse said, we can't give you any more, Marcelo, you're gonna die. But I was cussing and screaming because it was so painful. The next 2 days were just pure hell. Because they did a biopsy, I was constantly bleeding. Because they did the biopsy while going inside of me, into my bladder, to see why I was leaking a little tiny bit of blood, they made the problem even worse. Now, because I don't urinate due to dialysis, that cut from the biopsy was making blood just leak and fill up in my bladder to the point where I would feel full and it would start coagulating, clotting up. And my bladder would be so full of blood that I would have to go to the bathroom and urinate it out, but in chunks of coagulated blood. The amount of torture and agony that I was in, I would be yelling and screaming because it was so painful to pass this through my body. When the bleeding wouldn't stop, doctors came with an idea and they said, you know what? This is not good. You're bleeding way too much. And I was just in pure hell. They said, we need to do something that is called a irrigation, Marcelo. I didn't understand what that was, but I just wanted this to stop because if it didn't stop, I couldn't live like that. I couldn't live like that. The people that don't know what a irrigation is, that is when they put a catheter inside your private part and there is water or saline that is literally flowing through you. It's inside of you all day, every day. And they had this in me for, I think, 2 to 3 days. They were hoping that the irrigation, again, because I don't urinate, that it would filter out, right, constantly, and hopefully it would stop. It would get the blood to move, pass through, that it was collecting through a bag that I had next to me, and that it would stop the bleeding. There was no rest. There was no sleeping. This 2 to 3 days, mind you, the 2 to 3 days of me bleeding before that, now we're more than a week in, and then the irrigation on top of that, I'm crying day in, day out. I'm going to dialysis. I'm begging for my pain medicines, to the point even where the dialysis techs were getting mad and frustrated with me because I was, please, I need my medicine. I need my Dilaudid. It was one of the worst pains I've ever experienced in my life. And I've been through some shit. I've been through some stuff, man. This was top 3, but the hell wasn't over. They decided to go back in and do another cystoscopy, see what the hell was going on, why I wouldn't stop bleeding. I was praying that it wasn't gonna hurt as bad as it did the first time. And I just didn't care anymore. I just wanted to get that tube out of my private part. When I woke up from the second cystoscopy procedure, when I woke up again in the ICU, it was pure and utter, perfect torture, perfect agony. I'm cussing, I'm crying, I'm yelling. The nurses are yelling at me. Again, they're hitting me with all type of Dilaudid to try to knock me back out. But the pain, it was so strong. It was so horrible that there was nothing more that they can do. And I remember that the anesthesiologist, I saw him running to me, right? And that's when he said, I'm gonna give you IV ketamine on top of more than 7 milligrams of Dilaudid. And I just remember when he hit me with that, boom, in the intravenously, all of a sudden, boom, it's like, boom, it hit me. And I fell into this dark black hole. Everything turned red and I was falling. I was just falling into this grave, what it felt like. And then all I could see was my world just turn into fractals and geometrical shapes. The closest thing that I can relate it to or describe it as is there's this certain type of crystal that is almost, it's like rainbow colored, and it starts going into squares. But it was like millions of them. And I was just like, falling. And then, boom, everything was dark. I say all of that to say that none of that worked. The ketamine knocked me out for a period of time, but I woke up in my room to the horror of hell, of pain and suffering, more than suffering than a human could ever take. The next week, clotting, blood accumulating up in my bladder. I couldn't hold it anymore. And then I would go to the bathroom screaming, crying every single time as I passed it out. My mother and my sister, I remember she recorded my screams because I wanted her. And that was in an old phone, but it was like somebody was getting their torso cut off. And every day, probably 4, maybe 6 times a day, I would have to pass all that blood, bowls of blood, of clotted blood through my private part. It was so bad and so serious that they couldn't stop it. And I was in the hospital for almost a month of just torture. And it was just crying every day, to the point where I cried so much that the tears were starting to burn my face and it would hurt to cry. Almost I didn't want to cry anymore because my face was starting to puff up and it would sting. I was swollen because of that. I remember the final decision was, Marcelo, the doctors are telling me, because this is not stopping, we're gonna have to kill your bladder. They were telling me that if this doesn't stop, that they're gonna have to go back in and they're gonna have to put some type of chemical to kill my bladder. I was so desperate and honestly ready to end it. And I just didn't know what else to do. The morning of the procedure, I'm talking to different doctors, different surgeons, and I'm like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to kill my bladder. I still have my original kidneys, even though they're not working the way that they're supposed to. I want to be able to try to heal them. But if I kill my bladder, definitely not going to be a reality for me. I pleaded with them, there has to be another way. But they were like, there isn't. So again, the morning of my surgery, where I'm supposed to have this killing of my bladder, I requested to speak to the surgeon, to just ask him, like, is there nothing else? You know what? He was a very sweet man, very caring, very compassionate. I remember he was drinking coffee very early in the morning, and he sat at the foot of my bed. And he said, you know what, Marcelo? This is one thing that I can tell you. You can either go through this procedure and it will solve the problem, and hopefully you will be able to get away from this torture. But if you don't, it's a possibility that it won't stop and you'll keep going through what you're going through. But he said this, and it really stuck with me when he said it. He said, but you know what? Bleeding, it's very similar to when you nick yourself when you're shaving. Eventually, it will stop, hopefully. So you know what? It's really your call. You choose. If you want to have this procedure done, I'm more than glad to do it. But if not, then again, I'm more than glad not to do it. But it's your choice. When he said that, I was like, okay, you know what? I don't want to kill my bladder. I don't want that for me. I'm going to wait another couple days and hopefully it will stop. And during this time, I remember the doctors that were attending me, the physicians, they were like, you need to go home. You need to go home. They were forcing me. It is my right as a patient and with my insurance to stay here as long as I feel fit until this is over. Because if I go home and I'm still in all of this pain and all of this suffering, I don't want to have to come back to the ER and do all of that again. I'm already here. Thank God I chose the right thing, because after a couple of days, the bleeding finally started to slow down. After some time, I was recovered and living my normal life. But I will always remember this.